Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Innovfest Unbound 2017. Is everybody enjoying themselves? Thank you. I'm glad somebody's enjoying themselves. Right, so we're going to start this panel because we've got quite a big panel here today. There's 5 of us on it, or 6 including myself. And so we've got a lot of content to get through, and hopefully we can deliver some nice messages to you and some food for thought. What's quite nice about this panel, actually, just to give a bit of an overview, we've got a global set right here, so covering Asia, Europe, and the US. And we're also covering a lot of different ecosystem styles. So we've got everything from events to startups, to obviously everything from government to corporate to startup initiatives, again to startups again, and then also to corporate. So we're going to have a look at different environments of how to build ecosystems. I'll start by obviously just introducing everybody, and then you can all introduce yourselves and give a bit of a 1-minute overview, I'm sure. So this is Jenn Sander from Burning Man. Your official title is Global Innovation for Burning Man. We've got Marco Villa, for the Executive Director of Internationalization, Italia startups. Edgar Hardless, I'm sure a lot of you might be familiar with, CEO of Singtel Innovate. I'm going to try and pronounce this correct. LaRhette, perfect, President of MassChallenge. And at the very end, Dr. John French, the Associate Director of Global Innovation at Proctor & Gamble. Jenn, if you'd like to start by introducing yourself and obviously giving a bit of an overview of what you're here for.
Hi, yes, thank you so much. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. So I do global innovation for Burning Man, which really looks at the Burning Man events that happen around the world as sort of a pop-up city and how the culture is manifesting into real cities.
Cool, so tell me, one thing that we actually is quite interesting here, it's a different kind of event, it's a little bit, you've got edgy, chaotic, I mean, people come up with all sorts of ideas, but it's a very eclectic sort of event. So how does it continue to innovate on year or day by day?
Okay, well, I'd like to start by really quickly, if you don't mind, seeing how many people in this room have been to Burning Man before. Can I see a show of hands? Okay, not very many, about 5, 6 people. That's amazing. So how many people have heard of Burning Man before? Okay, quite a few more. So just to kind of help level this up real quickly, I'd love to show a quick video clip to kind of demonstrate the sort of petri dish of innovation that Burning Man really is.
We arrived out at this vast plain. I took a stick and I drew a line on the ground. And I said, on the other side of this line, everything will be different. And everything has been different.
The place is an idea. That's so powerful and so alluring that people will go to the worst place in the world just to get a little taste of it.
It's very disconcerting in a 1-week period of time to realize that everything that you've done in your entire life could potentially be wrong.
I walked away from Burning Man going, I need to learn how to weld because I've got ideas. I still have a long ways to go.
So there you go. That's just a really quick clip to kind of demonstrate that Burning Man is ultimately a kind of maker city. It's a place where people go for 1 week of the year to come together and build the world that they want to live in. It's a sort of DIY community, and through the principles of participation and engagement, people learn how to do things they wouldn't otherwise necessarily know how to do. And a result of that, it leads to a more kind of active prototyping culture where people are really kind of visually conceptualizing things that they might not otherwise do, and in a way that other people can interact with them, and in that way innovation continues to kind of manifest.
Excellent. That's quite interesting because obviously it's a different style of innovation, it's a different style of event-based where where people are collecting together, working together on a different sort of environment. And how does that chaotic environment, piece together? How do they continue to, how do they innovate with one another? Never met before, you know, in these sort of situations where, you know, there's not a lot of resource and things like that. How do they come up with these sort of inspiring ideas?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. So a lot of it has actually to do with providing the permission to enter into a kind of blank canvas and play. I'd say that as adults, we've sort of lost track of what true authentic play really means, and we tend to follow instructions instead of engaging our imagination. And Burning Man really encourages people to sort of get lost in time, do things for no reason, and almost above all, have no commitment to outcome. You know, really trying things and not being afraid of failure, and that really pushes the boundaries of what's possible. In relation to the resources that you were suggesting, almost all of it is crowdfunded. Burning Man does not create any of the content that you saw there. We ultimately provide porta potties, and we design some very basic infrastructure, a sort of community center that's at the heart of our city. And outside of that, everything is user-generated content. So people have to bring their own food, they have to bring their own shelter, and in that way, that almost very basic survival mechanism, almost like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, people slowly start to build the world they want to be a part of and reach self-actualization and innovation quite quickly.
Amazing. I mean, I can imagine people come from all over the world to, you know, Burning Man or the main event. And I remember you saying before, you do a few events all over. I mean, how do they all differ? I mean, can you build this in other locations around the world, in different cultures, different environments?
Yeah, I mean, I think we had a slide of the 10 principles that we could put up really quickly. So basically, somewhere around 2004, the founder of Burning Man, Larry Harvey, decided that he wanted to create some basic mechanisms that different people, when they came to the event, when they went home, they said, hey, I want to have a Burning Man near home, what can I do? They could follow these very loose guidelines. So that became the sort of partnership and affiliation catalyst, but we now have transitioned into a nonprofit for exactly that reason. We're trying to provide resources and education to organic offshoots that are emerging as a result of Burning Man culture. There are 68 full-on pop-up events all around the world, including one in Shanghai that's actually happening at the end of the month. You can get information on that at burningman.org. And there's, you know, one in Japan that's driven by the regional community in Tokyo. We have regional leaders all over the world. Another outcome that sort of applies to cities and real-world kind of permanent initiatives is Burners Without Borders. They were a group that were born out of Hurricane Katrina. So when Hurricane Katrina hit, they left the event and they said, we have infrastructure, we have heavy machinery, we have water, we have know-how, we're going to go around and help out. So they went down to the hurricane site and they started helping out. And as a result of that, there's now a community called Burners Without Borders all around the world that are all crowdfunded and come together to rebuild temples after disasters and assemble art in communities, refugee communities, and other areas that actually need these elements of inspiration to continue innovating and progressing.
Excellent. I mean, it's very interesting because, Mike, you have a similar sort of, I mean, you've with MassChallenge, you started obviously in the US, you replicated the structure in the UK. I mean, how do you manage to build these environments but keeping the right kind of culture to the cause?
Yeah, so I think I was trying to play off Jenn's comment about providing porta potties. We provide bathrooms for our startups, I guess. But and MassChallenge, just for a 30-second pitch, we are the most startup-friendly accelerator on the planet. And we say that because we're a not-for-profit, and whatever we do for our startups, we give away with zero equity back. So there are a number of programs that we run around the globe, 5 programs currently. And to your question, you know, there are core things to our model as well. So there are a few things. One is we always keep the startups at the core. So wherever we go, whether it's geographically or in industries or working with partners, the question we always ask ourselves is, how is this good for the startup? How is this good for entrepreneurs? Secondly, we also operate at scale. So we don't want to do things in a small way. Everyone knows that, generally speaking, the number one ingredient for startup success is timing. We were born in the recession where there were really only 2 other accelerators, Y Combinator and Techstars, that were achieving that level of traction. So we were born as a jobs growth engine, and so we wanted to just do things at a massive scale. And so when we go somewhere, we don't want to just accelerate 10 at a time. In Boston, we accelerate 128 startups. In London, it's 100, and so on and so forth. So when we go somewhere, we want to think big, and that's the other piece. And then thirdly, it's about impact. And so we let the startups define what impact is, because we accept startups from any industry in any part of the world. But we want to make sure that we're striving for impact. So the startups that we aim to accelerate are those that have the highest potential for high impact. And then lastly, we are a community-driven program. So there are a number of parts of the ecosystem that make our model work. And so for us, it's about understanding the ecosystem, the strengths, the assets, the needs, the traction, the maturity, and then whether or not our model works. And it takes a fairly lengthy time for us to figure out, would the MassChallenge model work in this particular country or region? So some similarities to Burning Man, I think, there as well.
Yeah, I mean, there are a few there. I mean, it seems a little bit more structured, which is good. I mean, I think things work for different people, different countries, different communities and cultures. So, I mean, obviously with that sort of structure, I mean, do you see yourself being able to do something in Asia? I mean, is that a possibility?
Yeah, absolutely. I am wildly impressed just with what's going on here at the conference as an indicator for the maturity in the market. And there are lots of information and studies about this region, this country, and its readiness for innovation or entrepreneurship. And one thing struck me, and we work a lot with MIT, and they've done a lot in this region, and they suggested that maybe there wasn't enough of an entrepreneurial spirit here. And that's really, you can put all the things in place, the government, the corporates, the universities, the accelerators, incubators, co-working, but if there isn't that core want to be an entrepreneur and the acceptance of that risk, then that's the part that we have to investigate more. There was a panel this morning on the same stage, and one of the panelists was from the National University of Singapore, and she talked about going in and talking to the parents of the students to make sure that they understood that entrepreneurship as a path was actually okay, and that they didn't have to become a doctor or a lawyer or work for a big corporate, but rather, there could be greater rewards, and not just financial, for being an entrepreneur. So I think all of the signs are there, particularly for us, as we've seen them over the past 3 to 4 years, for being a place where a program like MassChallenge could thrive.
Great. So how long till it's here?
Sorry, how long?
How long have we got?
Oh gosh, give us.
I mean, you said before it's your first time in Singapore in Asia.
Fair enough.
So we'll give you some time.
Give me a 12-month runway, and we'll be maybe ringing a bell at that point.
Fantastic. That sounds great. That's really good. John, I mean, obviously P&G is a classic corporate, obviously, that keeps on innovating, keeps on reaching new heights and things, and it's obviously a very exciting company to be a part of, I'm sure. But with obviously the geographical area of Asia and obviously the fragmentation of the different markets, how do you, or how does P&G and yourself continue to innovate in all these areas?
Yeah, so, that age-old question of global versus local is a very difficult thing to balance. But I think often we tend to focus too much on differences rather than similarities, right? So there are a lot of very basic consumer needs that are global, right? So I'll give you just a little story that played out in our Crest area, white strips. We innovated that product to try to democratize tooth whitening, right? For years we were working on tooth whitening, and we had people going in, talking to consumers on a daily basis, and they kept coming back and saying, well, we need to innovate on how to whiten teeth. And one of our lead experts in the field came back after talking to consumers for a couple of years, and he got into real depth with certain consumers. He came back and said, consumers don't want white teeth. And they all said, what do you mean? We've been talking to consumers for a decade. They want white teeth. He said, no, they want white smiles, right? So once you change that language, you then changed how you innovate, right? We were all spending all this time looking at these tooth trays that dentists use to whiten your teeth, front, back, inside, outside. But when you said I want a white smile, it changed the innovation platform, right? And that created the white strips, right? So those fundamental needs exist across the globe. It's how you go about selling it and your end consumer proposition that drives the real win.
Excellent. That's quite interesting, actually. Yeah, make it relative, obviously, us as human beings. I think that's how, obviously, you need to make sure these things actually work. And I mean, obviously, in terms of the corporates, I mean, this is how do you find the right sort of ecosystems to be able to build on? I mean, engage. I know you mentioned before in Singapore you have over 1,000 people deployed here, which is, it's an amazing size. How do you find new markets to be able to just engage with and grow in? How does that build?
Yeah, so we have, I can never keep track of the total number of innovation centers we have across the globe. It's somewhere probably around 12. We've been here in Singapore now in a significant way for several years. We have about 500 R&D people and then another 400 or 500 commercial people sitting over in Buena Vista area. And I've been here for a year, but I've spent a lot of time in Asia over the years. I've lived in Japan for 5. And I can tell you, as you look at working around an innovation ecosystem, the key thing I try to focus on is a couple things. One is making sure you have a productive ecosystem, that you don't have to go outside of the local environment to go get the support you need, which is something that was missing for us here on the ground, right? We're still sending a lot of our stuff outside of Singapore to get data. And that's just really inefficient and not cost effective. But the other thing you need is a really multidisciplinary organization surrounding you, a group of people that surround you, all these different experience sets, right? Then you need integrators. Because really a winning consumer proposition is not just about the technology. You have to take into account economics, supply chain, regulatory, and clearly what the consumer wants. Right? And to make that sustainable, they have to want it over and over and over again for a long period of time, right? And in innovating in that space, you have to have the opportunity to create that sustainable business position for yourselves to really make it, something that is truly an ecosystem. And so, as a big company, that's the way I think the company thinks about ecosystem is a bit broader than what you see day to day.
Interesting. That's very good. And Marco, on your side of things, I mean, coming from obviously, from your background, and obviously where you've obviously built into the innovation and side of things in your ecosystem, the question that I want to know is, does innovation only happen in the private sector? Is that something that you see happening, or is there other areas where it sort of grows?
Well, my background is as a private investor, so I'm very private sector oriented in a way. So I wish my answer would be yes, in a way, philosophically, but reality is that obviously is not the case. The way the public sector can influence an ecosystem, especially now, is quite relevant, and I think we are now in an ecosystem that has been whose innovation has been fueled and is still supported, in a way also shaped and designed by the government or by the public sector. So maybe the question is not so much where innovation happens. Innovation can happen anywhere. It depends on what the framework is and how agile governments manage to be in setting the right framework. If we look at what happened in Asia in the last 10 years, for instance, we have. I remember I started coming to Asia with an investor eye about 10 years ago, and I don't think I'm offending anyone if I say that Hong Kong seemed to be a much bigger hub than Singapore at the time. In 10 years, we are telling each other, I guess, a very different story now, and we cannot say that happened without any intervention from the public sector. And well, to be honest, even if we look around the world, there are not that many places where an ecosystem was created without some sort of public role. Even the US or Silicon Valley, where officially or apparently there is no particular incentives or no particular heavy framework created by the public sector. Well, the reality is that a lot of innovation came from the defense sector, which was funded by the public. So it's not a question of if, it's a lot of question of how. And of course, here we have to say, well, something for for maybe European countries, the US, etc., it's definitely maybe easier to operate when you are in a small country than when you have a long country with a struggling debt and so on. And so on and so forth. So the level of agility is different, but it's not at this point. It's probably difficult to imagine a new ecosystem in terms of nations or cities that can come out of nothing in 2017 with all the others already happening without a smart government to kind of help this happening.
Yeah, I think. Well, I mean, you know. I mean, I'm sure you've heard this quite a bit, but I think Singapore is a very good example of that side of things. You know, and it's interesting to know if, you know, the initiatives that obviously government put behind it, and I think obviously what they do in Singapore is absolutely fantastic, but are they small and nimble enough with the right resources to be able to, you know, engage with this innovation? You know, do you find that that is something that they are able to do? I know you've mentioned obviously big and small, but on a global scale, is this something that government should be supporting? Are they able to do this?
So be supporting what? Sorry, you didn't get
in you know, creating these innovation ecosystems.
Well, everybody wants it. If I had the dollar for this place is the new Silicon Valley or wants to be the new Silicon Valley, I would be very rich now.
Yeah.
So I heard it about just about every country and every medium to small to big sized city around the world. But the reality is that, as we were saying before, that the combination of factors that is needed is pretty sophisticated, which is not a good enough reason, of course, for not trying. As we said, Singapore being an example in that direction, and so in a way, why shouldn't they? Jobs in the future are very unlikely to come from any pre-existing old-style industries. We know that. I mean, this is a truism, and the governments are smart enough to know that. So that's fine trying. I guess the real challenge is that from one side, what we need for true innovation, it's something like was described before, some of the principles of Burning Man, of co-creation, agility, and so on and so forth. And if you think about it, that's exactly the opposite compared to the way governments operate. It's not their fault. It's just the nature. So one of the problems when we design incentives or frameworks for startups is what defines a startup. So there's a set of rules that defines a startup. If you fit the rules, you are a startup for government purposes. If you don't fit those rules, you're not. And those rules can be more or less rigid depending on where you are. But still, they are the rules of today. In 3 years, would that definition still fit?
Yeah.
And if it doesn't, which is very probable, how long is it going to take to governments to actually find out it doesn't and redesign something that can actually serve a new reality, whatever that new reality it will be? So it's about agility, and sometimes it's about distortions too, because whenever a framework gets created, sometimes it tends to serve more than one agenda. Employment being one. I can bring the example of Italy in this sense. Government created a very good framework for startup, for innovation development, but we have a problem in our country, which is the south part of the country is a lot less developed than the north of the country. So it's quite reasonable that the government has an agenda of using innovation to develop the least developed part of the country. It makes sense. But then, at the same time, that creates a distortion because there's a lot more funds there. So if I have a good idea in the north, which is the most developed country, I have less opportunities to access capital and support governmental support than I am born in the south. So that's a little bit, it creates some weird situation. It comes out of a good intention, but it's something to take into consideration.
Excellent. No, I mean, you're right. I mean, it's different everywhere in the world in terms of obviously how these governments are initiating and influencing. I think it is important for, everybody wants to be, as you say, the next big thing, and it is just a matter of how do you do it. So, I mean, what I want to probably try and touch on is governments and startups. How do they help one another to be able to fuse this in these, in different environments? How do they, how do governments help startups? How do startups help governments? Is this a method of being able to, be the next Silicon Valley or the next Tel Aviv or whatever it is?
Well, I'm not saying, I don't think I'm saying anything new if I say that, that they need to listen to each other, which, there are good examples of this happening around the world. Of course, again, probably the smaller the country, the easier it is to set up a system in that direction. So certainly, startups can help governments. We said before, whatever happens in the future in terms of jobs, types of jobs, is very unlikely to come from old economy type of industries. So they know that, we know that, so we are aligned on that sense. Probably the key is for governments to be listening and to be listening to advisors from the ecosystem rather than relying on existing paradigms, which again sounds, it's not rocket science. We can get there, but then putting that into practice in a large country and with a large government, it's easier said than done. When it does happen and when there is agility, you can see results. I mean, the very first nation that was built on a public-private partnership was probably Israel, which is still a shining example on how you can make private and public money and minds work together. But if you try to apply that to other types of countries, it doesn't necessarily work. I remember I was in Israel a few years ago at the beginning of my angel time and visited the office of the chief scientist, who's the guy that decides where the money of the government goes, and it's quite a sizable amount. I don't remember how much it was, but it was a lot. And his office was a tiny little office with a chair on the back and plenty of books, and this guy with just one phone and a small laptop. Okay, and I was trying to imagine the person in the same position in some European countries, not to limit this to Italy, would probably have like a gigantic office with a beautiful view, 3 trees, a bar, and 7 meeting rooms that they would probably never use. Yeah. So it is a lot about the spirit that we use to do this. That also plays a very crucial role.
Great. Edgar, I mean, obviously, with Singtel Innovate, you obviously work very much between corporate, government, and startups. So this is quite, much your bread and butter. So how do you find that, these guys seamlessly sort of innovate with one another? How does that come about?
Well, look, I think, corporate innovation has really come to the fore over the last kind of 2 years. I mean, some players like P&G have been doing it for many years, but almost every week we get a call from a corporate saying, hey, can we understand a little bit about what you're doing and around innovation? So I actually think, an ecosystem requires all the players to be involved, right? And I think here in Singapore and the region, it's actually a very exciting time at this point in time because, Singapore, the government has taken a fantastic lead. They've supported, they've catalyzed a lot of the initiatives here. But I think what's real, and that now governments around the region are also similarly realizing that there's something they need to focus on. But I think the other really exciting thing from my perspective is also the number of corporates who are now looking to engage in the ecosystem and find ways to work with the government, with startups, to actually expand the innovation capacity in the region. And I think, especially at least in this part of the world, I think government and corporates have a significant role to play, maybe not so much in the US and in Europe, where more mature industries, but here there's a lot they can do to support and catalyze. So it's very encouraging to see a lot of corporates getting involved. Now, I think the opportunity is for government and the startup organizations around, MassChallenge, Burning Man as well, to also help guide corporates to how to best engage and support startups. Because, I think it's very easy to say, okay, we need to launch an accelerator, an incubator, all things. And some of those are right models to do, but I think there's an opportunity here to make sure we educate ourselves, and we're still learning in this process. Well, we've made a few mistakes along the way, but, it's experimentation, right? And I think the more that corporates are willing to experiment different models of how to engage and work with startups, I think it'll be particularly more exciting. And I think the government's done a great job of laying the groundwork here in Singapore. Now the corporates are coming in and actually getting actively involved. And I think there's an opportunity to actually start engaging with corporates from the startup ecosystem, saying, hey, this is the best way you can support us, right? And I think that's something I think you hopefully see more about, the more of that messaging going out to bring it together. But corporates, governments, institutes of higher learning, right? And obviously the venture capitalists, the risk capital, all these people are important parts of the puzzle. I think, but in this part of the world, I think the more recent piece are the corporates in terms of coming in now we're only 7 years old. Some of the VCs in Singapore have been 20, 30 years here. There have been startups here for many, many years as well. So, but corporates are now getting actively engaged. And I think there's an opportunity now to actually leverage on their strengths to help the ecosystem around the region in tremendous ways.
Excellent. Yeah, so would you, I mean, that's a very good insight, obviously, in how it all works. I mean, you're very right. There's obviously, in the environment, obviously, of be it connecting or connectability, it is a matter of obviously being quite open and honest with what it is people need. Sometimes it can be a matter of hidden agendas and then nobody gets it right. So I think you're very right in terms of really just stating the scope and understanding what it is that we all need to engage with and how we can obviously help one another. So where do you see it expanding? Where do you see it, the vision going from here? Where's the future of it?
Well, once again, I think it's a great time to be a startup in Southeast Asia, right? Not just in Singapore, but in, I've had the privilege of seeing the ecosystems grow over the last 7 years in this role. And it's just amazing how much progress has been made in all these markets. You go to Manila, you go to Jakarta, you go to Bangkok. And I remember when I went to Bangkok 7 years ago, there were 2 co-working spaces. No incubators, no accelerators. Now you go back there are a whole bunch. There are a lot of corporates now are supporting incubators and accelerators. There are a lot more VCs now, more funding available. And that same situation is replicated in Manila and especially in Jakarta as well, and here in Singapore. So I think it's naturally happening. And I think sometimes we have to be careful not to try to plan too far ahead. I mean, Silicon Valley wasn't planned from day one to 60 years where it is today, right? It happened, right? And as long as you provide, I think, as long as each of the parties understand their roles, government is there to support, catalyze to move forward. Corporates are there, the opportunity to obviously leverage on the innovation that's coming out of these companies to support their customers and provide better customer experiences. Universities are there, the research in terms of what they do and offer to help create new technologies and solutions which ultimately entrepreneurs can take and then run with is important. And then the venture capitalists, the investors who are actually going to determine ultimately, which business models they think ultimately are going to make sense. I think this all comes together and it is coming together. I mean, I think, don't forget, this is a very young ecosystem in Southeast Asia. And you think how far it's come. We have a number of unicorns now in the mix here in Southeast Asia. We have some, this tech conference is by far the largest that's ever happened in Southeast Asia. And that's happened over a very short space of time. So I think it is coming together. I think the key for me is to make sure that there's open dialogue between the various parties. I mean, we spend a lot of time speaking to the government agencies, speaking to the universities, speaking to other corporates, and share our learnings and saying that this is what we think makes sense. And also, obviously, with the fellow investors, the VCs, and also the entrepreneurs. Because I think it's important that as long as we have an open dialogue amongst all parties, I think naturally we're moving in the right direction, right? And so I think I don't want to kind of assume or think that it's all going to be fixed or it's going to be 10 times better in 3 years' time. I think it will just naturally evolve. And I think there will be various organizations, government, corporates, organizations like MassChallenge, that will naturally evolve and help support and drive the ecosystem here.
That's interesting. I mean, Jenn, just throwing a question at you as well. With obviously the involvement of, say, Burning Man, I mean, where do you see that going? I mean, will it turn into a bit more of a structural sort of thing, or do you think it will still be on a very, general sort of level of it can go anywhere?
Well, I believe in human-driven innovation, and I think that we're seeing a lot of things happen as a result of Burning Man culture. People go there, they learn to participate, they bring that more active role in participating in their cities or in their lives or starting entrepreneurialism or pursuits as a result of that. And I think that we're seeing different offshoots emerge outside of just the Burning Man events, which are sort of like catalysts for this kind of thinking. One offshoot would be sort of urban prototyping initiatives where I know it's scary, it's really, really scary, but if you don't hold on to potential outcomes and relinquish control, a lot of really amazing things can happen. So, for example, governments sharing data with citizens, wide open data shared with citizens and allowing entrepreneurs and engineers and general people to hack solutions, and then having this sort of large Cisco, Siemens, IBMs, whatever it might be, come in and help fund the solutions, and working together as an ecosystem is something that is very much in line with Burning Man thinking. And as time goes on, I think that we will see different versions of more participatory governments and more participatory cities for solutions and imagining potentials as well.
Brilliant. I think that, well, that's interesting, because obviously that's where obviously it can all sort of come together. I think that's quite interesting. John, where do you think it's going to go from here in the region? How's it going to grow?
So I've been using a kind of metaphor lately to try to describe what you should think about when you're going into an innovation ecosystem and trying to build it. And you have to recognize where you are in that ecosystem, right? So the metaphor I've been using is pioneer, explorer, and settler, right? As a pioneer, this is what I did 10 plus years ago. I was coming off into the region, and I was just charting the land, right? Didn't really get into any depth, right? And then we started staffing up a bit more here in Singapore, and we had a lot of explorers, right? People going in and looking at where is the strength, where's some of the skill sets that exist, where do you want to invest, right? And then settler, and interesting, pioneer and explorer in an American car context are both names for cars because they're aspirational, right? Settler, you will never find a car called settler. But it is the hard work, right, that really is required to build an ecosystem. And that gets back to that multidisciplinary thing I talked about before. You've got to bring a lot of different people together and have them integrated with each other to settle, to build those big cities, to build those end products that make a difference in people's lives. That's where we're going.
Good. I think that's, I mean, we've got just under a minute to go. I think what I'm going to ask you very quickly, what's the message for Singapore? What is it that we want to do? I mean, Mike, if you can share some sort of idea, what does Singapore need to do?
Yeah, so I think ecosystem, like the word innovation, is starting to become overused. And for me, that word ecosystem implies a self-contained system. And while we're very good at harnessing the strengths here, what we're seeing, at least at MassChallenge, is it's less about the country strength, it's even less about the regional strength. It's about the global network that is hovering above all of these locations for us, and you know, coining or sort of using thinking about entrepreneurship as more cloud-based entrepreneurship. So forget about location, forget about even industry. It's how do you tie in and get that connected layer above, and how can Singapore tie into that? Because I think there's a massive strength of assets with the multinational corporations, the maturity of the market, to plug in on a global scale, and in addition to strengthening the roots here.
Excellent. I think that's good. Well, look, I think that's all we've got time for. I've got the numbers flashing on the screen down there. Thank you, guys, for obviously a wonderful insight, obviously, into the different environments of startups and ecosystems. And that's us out. Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Michael and panel.